Good morning, everyone. This is Sustainability Modeling, lecture number 9. It's a lecture on economics, or an introduction to economics issues applied to sustainability models. We're going to be also focusing on revisiting the old problem of the tragedy of the commons. So the contents of the lecture will be basically going through some concepts in economics and how those can be introduced into the system dynamics modeling framework that we've been looking at for several issues in the class. We're going to be looking at system dynamics models for the economic value of time and for benefit cost analysis. And these two economic concepts are going to be important to fold them in to the sustainability modeling and to the system dynamics framework that we have been developing, because they allow to analyze sustainability issues from a feasibility standpoint, and also they allow for support in decision making and policy making issues, as we will see. And we're going to be looking at the tragedy of the commons problem in a little bit more in a more formal fashion through modeling and quantification, and looking at the different potential outcomes of the tragedy of the commons problem. So let's go through some basic concepts. I think we'll start with the present value and future value, and these are quantities and approaches that allow us to compare either profits, and we'll refer to profits in different ways depending on how we look at them, but we can call them also returns or benefits, as well as costs or investments over time. Okay, and typically, individuals, entities, they place a higher value on profits, returns, and benefits which occur in the present or in the near future rather than in the distant future. And the reason for this is it's a combination of uncertainty about the future, which of course increases the further that future is, and also the ability to have these profits available in the present for other purposes. So having profits, benefits in the present is always going to be it's going to have a higher value than in the future, for the most part. It's not always, but for the most part, that's how individuals and institutions, entities behave. Let's talk a little bit more formally about present value and future value. And present value is the future value of money that has been discounted to reflect its current value as if it existed today. Okay, that's the formal definition of present value. I'll give you an example, or a couple of examples, in a second. Now, future value is the future value that is given to a sum of money as it is worth at a specified time in the future, assuming a certain interest, a rate, or rate of return. Okay, so the present value and the future value are concepts that are actually dependent on each other, or they're associated with each other. Essentially, the way present value and future value work is that you have two quantities: a rate of interest, which can be called a rate of return or a discount rate, but it's essentially this is the proportion that the amount of value either loses or gains over time, and then you have to specify the time period over which you want to calculate the present value of the future value. So I is the discount rate, and this is the rate at which the present value declines into the future. This rate attempts to capture items like risk, uncertainty, and alternative investment possibilities. So really, this discount rate is it's an estimate. It's you need to make some assumptions in order to arrive at it, and that sometimes is a fairly controversial topic, and it's not trivial by any means. The formulation is very simple and trivial, but actually coming up with the discount rate or rate of return, this is what people invest a lot of time and resources to arrive at, to make decisions. And then of course your horizon, your time horizon for decision making. So those are the two, essentially the two parameters that are coming into play. Now let's take a look at the present value issue in Vensim. So this is this model. It's in the lecture folder. Because it's such a simpler model, I didn't make a specific video about it, but you can certainly scrutinize and go through the model in detail, because the Vensim model is going to be in your directory. But it's got a single stock, okay, and this stock is depreciated over time, okay. The depreciation over time occurs at a specified discount rate, and also you can see that there's a time horizon plan here. In this case, you do it over, you can do it over 50 years, and it'll give you essentially, the depreciation of initial. In this case, it's $100, and so the way this curve could be read, if you go to the present value of $25 discounted at a rate of 3.1%. 45 years into the future is $100. So essentially, what this is saying is that, if you're $100, 45 years into the future, $100 today, 45 years into the future at a discounted rate of 3.1%, it's going to be worth $25. Conversely, if you were to have $25 45 years from now, okay, so you're right there, okay, and you were to bring that into the future, bring that into the present, to know how much that it's worth, at a discount rate of 3.1%, the result of that is $100. So that's essentially how this is read, and you can think about the sort of the parallel question, or the question asked the other way around, which is the future value, okay, and you can also do this in Vensim. And in this case, you have imagine that you have that you invest an amount, again, let's say $100, and how much that investment appreciates into the future at a given interest rate. So the way to read this result is, the future value of $100 at a rate of return of 3.1%, 20 years into the future, like there, is $184. Okay, that's essentially the concept, and how these can be implemented in Vensim. And it's just a matter of if you take an amount, and you just bring it into the present value by by applying the interest rate in this case, or this would be the for future value, the rate of return. So there's a return on investment, that you invest 100, and 20 years from now you get 184. That's the rate of return. That's the return on investment. Okay. Now you can think of what happens when you generate an annual profit or an annual benefit, and how that accumulates, and how you can calculate that into a profit. Okay. By the way, I just noticed that cumulative is improperly. There's an extra M in there that shouldn't be there. Apologize for the spelling error. I'm going to fix that. But essentially, imagine that you have this situation where you generate annual profits into in the future. You generate and then you compound those at an interest rate, and this cumulative benefit calculates how these benefits accrue over time, and then converts them to present value. Okay, so the best example of this is the careers or the lifetime earnings of an individual. So if you some people make this calculation. If you decide to be either a lawyer, a doctor, or a social worker, you can get an idea of what your earnings are going to be in a lifetime, and then you can bring those to present value, and use that to compare options, and for example, which of those two or which of these three has a higher, lower present value will give you an idea of how to make a decision. Okay, so that's one way to apply this. There's also the cumulative cost. Okay, and this it's essentially the same issue viewed the other way around. This calculates how costs accrue over time and converts them to future value. So imagine that you're going to be you're going to be making payments on something, and of course the best example of these are mortgage or debt repayments. The idea is you're going to be making payments, and essentially you convert those to to future values over time. Okay, at a given interest rate. So that's the idea. And in this case, you had I think this was an annual payment of $100, and how that translates into over time into essentially the cumulative cost. So this is how much it would cost you over time to pay $100 per month. Okay. Talk about benefit cost analysis, and this is a useful tool to compare and decide among alternative investment options or alternative arrangement options. For example, if you're going to compare building a dam for flood control to building a road to improve access to a location, to building a hospital, or to preserving an ecosystem. So if you're going to spend your money in any of these options, how do you decide? And then you use benefit cost analysis to comparatively analyze these options, and that's the most common way of using benefit cost analysis. And of course, this analysis involves, as the name indicates, quantifying each alternative's benefits and costs. And the concept is fairly simple, but implementation can be complex because you need to have a proper accounting of benefits and costs of each option. And if options are not different, it might not be as easy. So it's not trivial. A second issue that comes into play is the planning horizon. Over what period of time are you going to calculate these benefits and costs? Because you're going to be, this is essentially a cumulative issue. You're going to be accumulating these benefits and costs as we just discussed over time, and adding them up. So you need to have a planning horizon. And of course, last but not least, and last but not less trivial, is the choice of the discount rate that you need to apply. And there may be other factors, but these three are the most common. So benefit cost analysis, simple idea, tough to implement. Now see how we do benefit cost in Vensim. And imagine that you have and this is a sketch of a model in Vensim that you can look at as well in the directory for the lecture. So imagine that you have a project that has some costs associated with it, mainly construction. You're going to build something, and then cost to operate and maintain the system. So this could be, this could be a road, this could be a dam, this could be a treatment plant for water. Any sort of infrastructure is going to have construction costs as well as operating and maintenance costs. And then presumably this infrastructure or this project is going to generate some revenues. You're going to be selling something out of it. You're going to be selling clean water, or you're going to be you're going to have toll in the roads, and you collect the revenue there. Whatever there's a revenue generating stream. And then you need to compare the benefits, in this case revenues minus the costs, these two, in an annual benefit cost calculation, and then you bring those to present value so you can analyze how this particular project performs, okay, from a benefit cost standpoint. That's the general idea. So in this case, this is a very simple situation. You have here, these are the construction costs, and in Vensim, this particular project model was set up by having an input table where you have time here. So, and these are the costs in, I guess these are in millions of dollars over time. Okay, in this case, you can see that you sort of build the project in sort of 5 years. So your construction costs are spread over 5 years, 1.2 million, 1.1, sort of, and then after 5 there's no construction cost. So this sort of curve drops very rapidly, and then for the remainder of the 50-year planning horizon, and there's a 50-year planning horizon in this model, you have no construction costs. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. The operation and maintenance costs have a different structure. You know, they're also spread over 50 years in this table. Okay, but in this case, you have very little operating costs at the beginning because you're building, you're constructing, so you're not operating the system. You're not, you don't have any cars on your road. You're not treating any water in your plant. You're not operating your dam, whatever infrastructure you're building. But then after 5 years, actually after 5 years, then you start building up. Actually, this starts. It looks like it starts accruing cost a little bit earlier than that, and then you start, building costs over time. And of course, the longer you go into the future, the more expensive the infrastructure is to operate. In this case, so let's take a look at that. And these are millions of dollars again. If you look at the benefits. The benefits have a sort of similar structure to the O&M cost. You have benefits spread over 50 years. At the beginning, you have no benefits because the project's not even operating. But after some time, you start collecting some revenue, and then your revenue stream starts growing over time. Okay. So if you bring these together, and this is done in the Vensim model for this benefit and cost. You can see a couple of things. First, the annual benefit and cost. So this is the year per year or year by year. What is the difference between the benefits and the costs? And you can see that at the beginning of the investment, the first few years, first probably 7-8 years or so, you're operating in the red. You're essentially, your costs are exceeding your benefits. But after that, your benefits exceed your costs. If you accumulate that over time, which is the accumulated net benefits, then again you can see that first few years, you take a hit, but then your investment starts paying off, and then you can collect revenue over time. Okay, so these are millions of dollars of accumulated net benefits over time for this particular project, and then you can, if you were to do this for several projects or several alternatives or several configurations of a given project, then you can probably figure out which of these is going to generate the better benefit cost ratio or benefit cost difference. Now let's take some of these concepts and look at the problem of the tragedy of the commons. Okay, and we're going to be now revisiting this issue, and we've discussed this before. But we're going to be doing this in a more formal way through modeling. Now, the issue comes about, just to refresh our memories, when you have free, meaning either zero or very low cost access to a renewable resource. And this generates competition for what is left of the resource. If there's something free out there that can be used, and will be used, and will be used competitively. Okay, and so that generates this potential tragedy issue, because the incentives for each individual or an entity or any competitor to maintain a given size of the resource is typically quite small. There is no incentive to keep the resource there. So typically too little of the resource remains such that it cannot be renewed. So these are renewable resources. If you draw them down too hard or you draw them down too low, then you may lose their renewability of these resources. And this is commonly observed, no pun intended, for grass used by commoners in a village, which was the classical example in the paper, a 1968 paper by Harding that's in the reading for this class. But it's also found in issues of fisheries in open oceans, clean air, clean water. These are all common resources or commons. Okay, and then there's a potential tragedy that is embedded in there if sustainability practices are not properly implemented. So a little bit of this part of the lecture is to try to get into what that sustainability means in this context. So let's look at the problem setup, in this case we're going to model the process of unimpaired access to grass commons by sheep, okay, which was the original tragedy of the commons problem. Let's say the commons have an initial stock of 250 hectares of grass, and then the grass stock can grow up to a maximum of 1,000 hectares. So there's a limited. This is a limited stock, and has an initial value of 250 hectares. The only way the grass can be removed is through consumption by sheep. So there's no other mechanism. Grass doesn't die; it just gets consumed. And let's have 3 cohorts or age classes of sheep. Young sheep between 0 and 1 years, adult sheep between 1 and 2 years, and mature sheep between 2 and 3 years old. After 3 years, the sheep are removed from the commons. Okay, after 3 years they're kicked out, either because they're sold, they're taken somewhere. That's the setup that we have. So let me show you the Vensim sketch, and there's a full Vensim model in the lecture folder, as well as there's an accompanying video to this lecture on this model itself. But this is the Vensim sketch, and this is the grass stock, and I go in the video, I go through it in detail, but I want to go here through some basics. There's a grass stock. The grass has capability of growth, so it can get renewed naturally. The grass can grow for given climate conditions, rainfall, a given set of conditions that are external to the model. The grass then it can be consumed, and is consumed by 3 cohorts of sheep. So, and each sheep essentially consumes the commons, and that generates a growth decay dynamics for grass. Okay, the grass has an initial value, and it's got a maximum, it's got a cap as to how much it can grow. In the model, I go into a little bit more detail as to how, what the equations for each of these looks like. Now, in this model, the rate of grass growth is dependent on the amount of grass. So if there is less grass, the grass will grow faster. If there's more grass, the grass will go slower until it reaches. If you're at a maximum level of grass, then there's no growth. So this essentially keeps the grass to a maximum size, and this is meant to imply that the grass resource is a limited resource. Okay. The grass consumption by sheep is also assumed to be dependent on the availability of grass. So depending on the hectares of grass that are available, the sheep will consume more, and that's it's a fairly simple assumption. Might be too simplistic, but it does the job to show some interesting dynamics. And we're assuming here that the younger, young cohort consumes a little bit less grass per capita. These are rates of consumption per sheep. So this is in hectares per year per sheep. Okay, so these are the young. This is the first cohort. These are the adults, and these are the mature. And we're assuming that each one consumes more than the next. That's probably very reasonable. Okay, so this is in the model formulation. Now let's take a look at the sheep population dynamics. So let's take a look now at the sheep. And again, there's 3 cohorts: the young, the adult, and the mature. The birth rate, or the births of sheep, are assumed to occur as a percentage of the mature cohort. All this is saying is that only the mature cohort reproduce. Okay, and so they reproduce, they create young, young sheep. The deaths of sheep are assumed to be a function of the consumption of grass, and I'll show you how that dependence is drawn in. But the general idea is that consumption of grass controls the death rate. So if you consume too little, you die faster. If you consume plenty, then you don't die as often, or you may die for other causes, not because you're not eating grass. There's an aging process here. So if you know, after, you know, the sheep that don't die, they age, and then they move on to the next cohort. And of course, after the 3 years, they're retired from the commons, as I mentioned before. And then there is an ability of the villagers to add sheep to the commons, and this is meant to follow a strategy or some sort of rationale. So the villagers have a way or a strategy or a rationale to add sheep to the commons for feeding purposes. So this is going to be the way that human intervention in this process affects the dynamics. So here is the Vensim sketch for the sheep stocks, and again, in the video for the model, I go into a little bit more detail, but let me walk you through the basics. You have 3 stocks of sheep. Each stock has inputs and outputs. The young stock of sheep, the 0 to 1 year olds, have births, which are proportional to the stock of the mature sheep. Okay, so the mature sheep reproduce. So the births go in there. Some die. Okay, and the deaths of sheep are driven by a death rate, and the death rate is dependent on the consumption of grass. So the consumption of grass has an impact on the death of sheep. The sheep that don't die on the cohort move on to the next one by aging. They age a year, they move on to the next one. Okay, and then there's a possibility that the villagers in the middle of the year or throughout the year add sheep, and that adding sheep is driven by a rationale. And I came up with a couple, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, a couple of approaches to add sheep: the short-sighted approach and the conscientious approach. So that happens with the younger flock or the younger stock of sheep. The adults get fed in by the younger sheep that age in to the second cohort. Some of these sheep die. Okay, again with the death rate driven by consumption of grass. Those that don't die move on to the next cohort, and the villagers have the capability of adding sheep to that cohort according again to some rationale. Once we get to the third cohort gets fed in by the aging of the adult sheep. Some of these sheep die, and the death is driven again by consumption of grass. Whichever don't die age out beyond 3 years, and then they're removed from the commons. And you can imagine these sheep are being sold to market, or something's happening to them. And then again, the villagers have the ability to add sheep to that cohort, to the commons. Okay, so that's essentially the general schematic. Now let's take a look at the rate of death of sheep, and this rate essentially, as I mentioned before, and this a similar relationship follows for all the cohorts. I'm showing you the mature cohort, but it's essentially driven by the consumption of grass. The larger the consumption is of grass, the lower the death. So if the sheep are eating plenty of grass, then the death rate drops, because they may die from other causes, natural causes, but not because they lack grass. However, if you start running out of grass, if they start consuming less and less grass, and these are again the units of consumption are hectares per sheep per year. So this is a per capita consumption. If they start consuming less, then of course their death rate goes up. Okay. If you look at the aging of the sheep, it's essentially the opposite. The opposite. It's 1 minus the death, and this essentially is meant to say essentially the opposite. If the sheep eat plenty of grass, if they consume plenty of grass, they're able to age and move on to the next cohort. If they're not, if they eat less grass, then they won't be able to age. and they'll die. So that's the sort of the trade-off there. Now let's look at the adding sheep criteria or approaches. Here, there's the criteria of the approach of rationality. And the idea is that sheep of any cohort are not added to the commons if the number of sheep deaths in that cohort exceeds the number of sheep that age into the next cohort. And this essentially makes the assumption that the villagers are rational. And they only add sheep if they see that sheep are able to age from being in the commons. If they put sheep in the commons and the sheep start to die, then they stop, they don't do this, okay? Because it's not good for them. So this is the rationality assumption or approach or criteria embedded in the villagers' strategy for adding sheep to the commons. The next strategy is a strategy of short-sightedness, which basically means that sheep are added to the commons depending on the number of sheep already in the commons, but regardless of the availability of grass. So here, this is why it's called short-sightedness, is because imagine that the villagers look at the commons and say, well, there's plenty of sheep there, so they look like they're doing okay. Why don't we add some more? Okay. But this approach doesn't take into account the availability of grass. And sheep might be doing okay. If you add more, then maybe the grass will run up quicker. And so this is the short-sighted approach. This is the what I would say in more colloquial terms is the take it while you can approach. If the grass is there, let's just grab it while it's there. Okay. So that's another approach. And then there's the more conscientious or the conscientiousness approach, in which sheep are added to the commons depending on the availability of grass, but regardless of the number of sheep already in the commons. So in this case, villagers decide to add, they take a look at the commons and say, well, there's plenty of grass, we can certainly add sheep because they'll be fed, they'll be taken care of. And so you keep an eye out on the resource that you're depleting, not on the consumers that are depleting the resource. That's why we call it the conscientious approach. Okay, so let's see how these scenarios or approaches play out. And in this model, it simulates or can simulate two basic scenarios. In both scenarios, we're going to assume that the villagers are rational. So we're not going to assume that the villagers are doing anything on purpose to hurt themselves or hurt their sheep. So this is the rational plus short-sighted assumption. So in this case, look at what happens. What I'm plotting here is the grass available in the commons over time, and the time horizon of this model is 100 years, and the total sheep. So this is the three cohorts added up over time, and you can see that this essentially results, the short-sightedness approach results in a system that oscillates between, the grass goes up and it comes down, goes up and it comes down, because sheep, they go down and they come up, and the problem that you're facing is that because you're short-sighted, grass is getting consumed too quickly. Okay, when grass gets consumed, the sheep collapse because they start dying more. There's no grass to eat. So this results in in cycles of ups and downs in the system. You can actually take a look also in this same simulation at the sheep per cohort. You can see that it's this cycling up and down, and goes on in the three cohorts. And what's interesting also is that the periods of no sheep, all sheep getting wiped out, are longer than the periods where the sheep can thrive. So this scenario is completely senseless or unsustainable. It doesn't show any sustainability. So this is a summary of the results of that simulation. There's fluctuating stocks of grass and sheep in the commons. And these cycles are viciously and perpetually repeated. The herd sizes collapse, and then they stay virtually zero for a while, and then they recover when the grass is able to recover. Okay, but then they draw it back again. So in response to restocking too rapidly, because this happens because you're adding too many sheep too rapidly, the end result is that there are too many sheep in the commons, and the sheep decimate the grass, and then they die. So this is the tragedy, simulated. And this is followed by the grass stock recovering, and then sheep being added again. So again, you see a cycle, a vicious cycle, where grass is able to recover after a while, and then the villagers say, "Oh, there's grass again. Let's throw in some more sheep." So now let's take a look at an alternative approach, which is the rational and conscientious approach, and this leads to some sustainable dynamics. The way, just in order to compare apples with apples, this simulation was done so that the average grass over time was more or less the same as in the short-sighted approach. So let's assume that we're going to keep the average grass over time more or less the same, and at about 375 hectares of coverage, and you can see that that's sort of the average value within the fluctuations of the short-sighted approach. So if we do that, then how many sheep we can get, or how many sheep we can sustain in the commons under that scenario. And what you see here is that you reach a much lower number of sheep, but it's more stable. Okay, so that's the trade-off. You get more stability. You don't get these fluctuations. You don't get to wipe out the sheep and the grass, but the trade-off is that you're able to sustain less sheep over time, or at least on the average sense. And this is the number of sheep again. The system is stable throughout. So you can summarize some results here. First of all, there's more stable grass and less sheep occur as a result of considering the availability of grass as a decision-making trigger to add sheep. There's relatively lower numbers of young and adult cohort sheep that appear to inhabit the commons. Can you explain this? I want you to think about this and try to see why is it that we get more, more mature. There's a sort of population tilt towards the mature. Another question that I'd like to ask you to explore is for more or less the same number of sheep in the commons, which approach yields less grass? Okay, so think about that. Look at the simulation results. And ultimately, is this approach better or worse for the villagers? I mean, would you rather have a more stable commons in terms of grass and sheep, or a fluctuating commons with grass that goes up and down, but maybe yields more sheep when it does? Okay, so think about that. In order to answer this question, I introduce, and going back to the economics issue, you can actually incorporate economic benefits into the system. And in the Vensim model, there is a module of it that we go through, in which you have some annual sales revenue. Okay, the sales revenue are obtained by selling sheep. So you can sell all cohorts of sheep that are in the commons. And then you can bring those sales into present value over time, and with a given interest rate, or with a given discount rate, okay, or rate of return. You can do that. And in the model, I specify how these calculations are done. But what this results is, if you look at the rational and short-sighted approach versus the rational and conscientious approach, I mean, it's fairly predictable that you would get, in the short-sighted approach, you would get the oscillations, because again, this is driven by availability of sheep and availability of grass, and so the dips and the peaks show. So if you do this over time, you can see that the benefits start accruing, but you get the cyclic behavior. If you do it in the conscientious case, you get a more stable more stable income or more stable revenue from operating the system. And of course, the amounts are higher. When they occur, the amounts are higher in the short-sighted approach. So it'll be a matter of seeing, which of these two, and this is a question for you, which of these two is better for the villagers, okay? So let me summarize some questions for you. So I want you to play with this model and tell me, or with these models, and answer some of these questions. So first of all, is there a balance between the two approaches? Would a combination of the approaches of short-sightedness and conscientious, would that work better than any of the two alone? Okay, that's not a trivial question to answer, but you can certainly simulate some scenarios and get an answer. Now, which of these two approaches work better in terms of generating more economic benefits over time? Okay, either higher paydays versus more steady income. So I want you to answer this question based on the model results. Then we can start thinking about some interesting ideas. How would you implement a tax or a fee per sheep introduced into the commons? And what impact would this have on the results, particularly on the economic benefits? So imagine now that you charge villagers for introducing any given sheep into the commons because they're going to be using grass, and you're going to charge them for the grass that they're going to be consuming. What would this do to the results, and is there any way how can you implement this into the rationale? Because now the villagers are thinking, well, in addition to being short-sighted or conscientious, now I have to be cost aware, so that's another criteria. Think about how you would do this, and I want to see you modifying the model, running it, posting your insights and results on Facebook. Again, I want to see more of this. I want to ask you to investigate approaches. This is not a new problem. This problem's been around for a long time. So I want you to look in the literature and try to find out what are approaches for managing access to zero or low-cost renewable resources, and see if we can introduce those approaches here to avoid the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so I want you to work on this and share your insights and your results on our Facebook page. I'd like to see what you find out. I'm curious. I'm dying to know. So to put a wrap on this lecture, you can watch these videos. There's the Vensim model video and of the tragedy of the commons. This goes through the all the details of how the model is put together, the equations, the simulations, how it's run, and also the benefit cost. And there's another nice YouTube video on the that I saw on the tragedy of the commons. That's a short video you can take a look at for curiosity. So I'll leave it at that. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll be uploading these videos for you to look at in the Dropbox folder. Okay, enjoy the week.